The Race F1 podcast is brought to you by Merrill. It's no secret that finances can get complicated. Like me, I'm sure many of you listening will have financial goals. Perhaps it's even saving up for that trip to a Grand Prix far afield. Whatever your goals are, from starting a business to saving for kids' college to getting more stamps in your passport, you want a straightforward path there. But life tends to have other plans, and things get in your way. Merrill understands that. That's why with a dedicated Merrill advisor, you get a personalised plan that can help keep your money in sync with your life. So with the bull at your back, no matter what life brings, you get a clear path forward. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merrill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated, registered broker-dealer, registered investment advisor, member SIPC.
Auto insurance can all seem the same until it comes time to use it. So don't get stuck paying more for less coverage. Switch to USAA Auto Insurance and you could start saving money in no time. Get a quote today. Restrictions apply.
USAA.
The Athletic.
We dissect Renault's decision to bin its power unit programme and what that means for the future of Alpine F1. Tackle the latest tech controversy and answer your questions on tyre management, engine sounds and slipstreams. Welcome to another episode of the Race F1 Tech Show. Predictably, I'm Edd Straw, and far more importantly, I'm joined by Gary Anderson, designer of Grand Prix winning cars and with half a century of experience at the top level of motorsport. How's things, Gary? Enjoying this sort of impromptu gap in the F1 season?
Well, I don't think it's as good as a summer break. So yeah, it's a bit of a break. It will give a few teams time to sort of have a think about stuff because there's 6 big races coming, to be honest. And I'm looking forward to seeing who does what over this little break period, because obviously there is no restrictions. It's not a compulsory holiday time. It's just a flat-out work time to try and improve your performance. So it'll be interesting to see who can make that step come Austin, and or if anybody makes a step come Austin. But the constructors is a real big battle between Red Bull and McLaren because, as Ron Dennis once said, second is the first of the losers. So whoever is second in the constructors is the first of the losers. And constructors is the big payday. So that's the thing that the teams want to win or do as well in it as possible. The Drivers' Championship sort of comes with it, to be honest. So it's one of those situations where you get 6 races now to make sure you step in the right direction, and it'll be interesting to see who can do that.
Yeah, all eyes will be on Red Bull, obviously, because McLaren is on current form is in complete control of the Constructors' Championship now with the lead it's got, but things can change. And obviously this is, as you say, the last window of opportunity, really, because then there's 2 triple headers, albeit with a 2-week gap between it rather than just the shorter gap. But yeah, this is the window of opportunity. So the work that's been done in the build up to this and the decisions made and what's being made on the production line right now is going to be decisive.
Well, yeah, the McLaren's biggest asset is they got 2 drivers very capable of winning. If one has a little bit of an off day, the other one's there to pick up the pieces. So as long as they can keep that momentum going, and the constructors is theirs to be had. As I say, it's going to be down to whether Lando can get a little bit of help in the drivers, because he needs cars between him and Verstappen if he's going to win the Drivers' Championship. So he needs other people to be up there and their car to be quick. So it's been no easy task. I mean, this little break now, definitely McLaren will have gone back and they'll have sort of scratched their head a little bit as to, is this real? Are we really that competitive? Will it keep happening? Will it keep going? It's not by any means set and sealed. Because as we've seen during the season, one team gets up there, then another team gets up there. So, it's been an interesting season and it's not finished yet.
Well, as always, in the first section, we'll have an open choice of topics. So what do you want to talk about first up in the world of F1 tech?
Well, it's the controversy always is the big thing. It's when a team's winning, there's always something that they're doing that's a bit questionable. That's what seems to be the trend these days. And we had the flexing front wings. Now, personally, I'm not blind. I can see quite well. And whenever I see the front view camera across the front wing, you can see the front wing flexes. Front wing flexes on all the cars to some degree. And it's, there's a set of load tests for that front wing to say whether it's legal or not. And that's what the teams work to. So, as long as you comply with that, you can, how the wing flexes outside of that is fine, or inside of that, is fine. And as you can see, everybody does it. Some do it more in a controlled manner than others. But that seems to have got put to bed to a certain extent now. And then it was the rear wing that we saw in the McLaren. That was the reason for their winning in Azerbaijan. Well, it wasn't. They just had a good package. It all worked. The gain from that rear wing that we saw, that, as people called it, sort of secondary DRS, would be so small, it would just get lost in the grey area of doing a lap time. So, but that was the big thing about it. That was, everybody jumped in there. Oh, that's why it's happening. And I think that's disrespectful to a team that's worked so hard to build himself a competitive car. And by going off to Singapore with a completely different wing assembly, a completely different track situation, which is not a high speed, long straight track. It needs downforce. It needs consistent downforce. Again, they dominated Singapore. So at the end of the day, when you've got a good package, a good team, drivers that are pushing, a team that's responding, a team that's got themselves looking at themselves quite closely, and I'll come on to that a little bit later, they do a good job. And I think it's, as I say, it's, from my point of view, it's disrespectful to say, look, this is why they won. It isn't why they won. It's part of a package that allowed them to win. And long may they keep doing it.
It's an interesting situation that arose there. Obviously, you've been involved on the team side in this sort of thing. Perhaps you can kind of take people a little bit behind the scenes, because obviously there was nothing illegal about the rear wing. Now, the way the rules are being applied have been sort of tweaked a little bit. The FIA have said they didn't really want to see it doing that again, but at the same time McLaren have said, oh well, we proactively offered to make a few changes in order to make sure things run smoothly, etc. So how does that whole thing work? And is this a case of McLaren pushing the limits? So they had that package for obviously Spa, Monza, Baku with the 3 tracks. That's your golden spell for those, that sort of characteristic, isn't it, where it'll give you the most advantage. It's only really Vegas you'd particularly want that characteristic in the rest of the season. So is that McLaren timing it well, pushing it, playing the politics well, and then stepping back at the right moment and just stealing a march on everyone just by playing that game properly, which is the whole point ultimately?
Well, it could very well be, but the first thing you have to sort of ask yourself is, did McLaren actually know the wing was doing that at speed? Because once again, it's the load tests are done on the wing to be within a certain limit, and not to damage anything really that's structurally on the wing, because you're not applying the maximum load into point loads as such. So it's a percentage of the total rear wing load. And McLaren, again with their wing and their tests, would test it to the FIA's load level, because that's what they have to comply with. So my big question is, there's no track testing. There's no testing that you can do to simulate that load that was on that wing in Azerbaijan. So did that wing flexing open McLaren's eyes to something that they didn't actually know about? Because that's the big thing about it is, perhaps by not having the wing do that, they'll actually have a better package, which is, I wrote in my column that, the way I'd look at it is you really want to try and keep the downforce, because if you can keep the downforce you've got, then instead of backing off the front wing to get the balance on the car, you sort of keep the rear downforce. So you end up with a car that's got more downforce, but still the centre of pressure can shift rearwards at high speed. So it's one of those sort of situations. As I say, the big question is, did McLaren see it happening on the TV coverage in Azerbaijan? And, obviously the FIA saw it happening, as did all the other teams and us. And they sort of met up and said, hang on, we didn't actually know that was doing that, but we will fix it for later on, because we think it will be better when we fix it for later on, which is, I genuinely believe it could be better if they stop it doing that for later on.
It could, of course, even be a characteristic that they were trying to create, but it's gone more extreme than perhaps they wanted it to. That's another possibility, isn't it? Because, like you say, it can only really be stress tested in action, and a track like Baku is unique in its configuration as well. It's interesting. I think you were maybe alluding to this earlier, but in Singapore, Andrea Stella, when he was talking about this, he was saying he thinks it's good news there was so much attention on the rear wing, because it means opponents are not focusing on themselves. And because Formula One's such a marginal game, it's so complicated. I keep repeating to my team, focus on yourself. So I think that's kind of what you were touching on. That's very much the thing Stella's trying to push to his team, to like, right, keep doing what you're doing. Don't let the noise and the distraction take your attention away from where it needs to be, and keep pushing on.
Yeah, I think that's completely right. You know, once the teams start trying to find a problem with somebody else, it means that they're not accepting that they've got, you know, that's where they really are. You know, it's one of those things where the first thing about making your car more competitive is recognizing where your problems lie, accepting it, and trying to get on with it. And I think that's one of the things that McLaren have done very, very well. And what I said earlier there, I'd come back to it. I think their McLaren's period with the Honda engine was one of those situations where, obviously, at that point in time, there was a lot of talk about, you know, we've got the best chassis in the pit lane, but the engine's nothing. You know, the engine's a GP2 engine. And I criticised that attitude for a while because I didn't agree with it completely. And it sort of got to a point, obviously, where they had enough of the Honda package at that point in time, because it wasn't working. The relationship wasn't working, I suppose, is the best way of putting it. I've worked with Honda before, and I know how hard it is to get them to accept a situation. And as I say, the biggest thing for me was they were thinking the chassis was the best in the world, and the engine was, as I say, a GP2 engine. The best thing they did at that point in time was to change to the Renault engine, because they had a measure against Renault, and it didn't just jump up suddenly that, you know, they were as competitive as the Renault package was at that time. It took a lot of work, but the big thing about it was they realised actually the chassis wasn't the best in the pit lane, and that there was a lot of work to be done. And obviously then they moved to Mercedes engine, again gave them a good measure against other competitive teams and competitive engines. And as I say, there's no hiding place then. You've got as good as somebody else, and you just got to accept it, recognise your problems, be it the car, be it manpower, be it the drivers, be it whatever. You've got to just recognise it and you fix it as quickly as you can. But as I say, for any team, the big thing is not to just look at other people and try to find a reason for them beating you because you think you've got the best car in the pit lane. Well, never, you know, you haven't necessarily, but it's a whole package at work. It's not the rear wing opening a 5mm slot gap at the ends of the flap extra to somebody else. That's not the one thing that does it. It's the whole thing that does it.
Yeah, and ultimately the McLaren is also at its absolute best on the high downforce tracks, isn't it? That's where it's relatively stronger, whereas when you go to lower drag ones, Ferrari can be stronger, relatively speaking, so can Red Bull. So if a flexi rear wing was the absolute key to McLaren's success, then its performance profile would be completely different. So yeah, that is the evidence that shows it's not purely that. Although it is interesting when it comes to the front wing, because obviously the air elasticity and the control of that is important in terms of trying to, you know, keep that aero balance there and not having the front wing pinned at high speed, so you get that oversteer. And so that's clearly an area where the strong teams are in good shape. Although if you were a McLaren, obviously there's the unknown for next year because they are looking at the flexibility. There seems to be an intent to modify the load tests to be ever more comprehensive. You're never going to be able to have a kind of real world load test that emulates the kind of load you'll see at the end of the straight in Baku, because these have got to be portable rigs that are run in garages. So there's, you know, you're putting huge loads on them. There's safety implications just for running the tests. But that's the interesting imponderable for next year, isn't it? How much that might change.
Yeah, I mean, the way the front wing is laid out in the design criteria, the main plane is obviously the main mounting one. That's the one at the front. And it tapers back at, I think it's 10, 12 degrees or something like that to the wing end plate. So the rest of the wing assembly puts a torque onto that main plane. So to actually do a carbon layup in that main plane, that would allow the load in the front wing flaps to rotate that main plane rearwards It's pretty simple. So it's not a complicated thing to do. The big problem really is the consistency of it, getting it to back off at the right speed, at the right time. If it's a linear stiffness, then obviously it will start backing off the minute you start to get load on it. So, we have critical corners ranging from, let's say, 100 kilometres to probably 300 kilometres if you take sort of Copse at Silverstone. So you want your characteristics to be between those two, a sliding scale, I suppose you might call it. You don't want it to suddenly get to 200k and then back off dramatically. It wants to be linear because that's where the characteristics of the car will be. The car will understeer a bit in 100-kilometre corners, and it'll be nervous rear end at 300-kilometre corners if you had an infinitely stiff front wing. So by backing off the front wing in a linear way from the loads of those speeds. So all you need to do is create a torque on the wing. It doesn't have to be massive loads. You just have to create a torque on the wing that will represent it. At the moment, the tests are done as a vertical deflection test. They're not done as a torque. You can come up with some torque in it, but the distance forward of the front wheel, the two differences, the two loads places, the two positions for the load test that they can put on it are not far enough apart to put a torque into it. They're too much directly on the end of the main plane, so they're a bending load really. So they've got to come up with a new test that will allow it to be tested properly to suit the application. But my argument about that is really that when you're backing off the front wing, the overall car's losing downforce. And why do you want to throw away downforce? You might get a better balance. I agree with that completely. And the driver drives the balance of the car. You might get a better balance by backing off the front wing, but you'll have less grip. So if you can do something to increase the rear grip, as opposed to decrease the front, you will end up with a car that's got a good balance and a car that's got more downforce. So in theory, a 300-kilometre corner where you want the rear end of the car to be stable, you'll go through it faster because you will have more downforce, which is what they strive for. Every team strives for more downforce, no matter whether it's at low speed or high speed. You still want it. At low speed, the downforce level is very small numbers, but it's still very, very valuable. The driver will always comment at low speed about, oh, that's better. If you put a bit more downforce in the car, oh, that feels a lot better. And actually, you're talking about, the difference in maybe 20 kilograms or something. Whereas that 20 kilograms at 300 kilometers becomes 100 kilograms or even more. So, it's little things for big steps. And as I say, backing off the front wing for me is a bit of a bandage. It'll get you a balanced car. But if you can find some way to not back off the front wing and increase the downforce on the rear wing, then I think you'll have a better package. And I think all this controversy about the rear wing could be someone that maybe has woken McLaren's eyes up to that. It would be interesting to see what their next sort of grey area that they might proceed into might be.
Well, if there's one thing that's for sure, it's that there is another grey area around the corner in F1 for one team or another. So I'm sure there'll be another controversy to talk about in the not too distant future. Right, for our main topic this week, we're going to look at the Alpine Renault situation. Obviously, Renault has confirmed that it's shutting down its F1 engine programme for 2026, so it'll become a customer team, and the Mercedes deal, while it's not announced, is expected to happen. So it'll still have a Renault engine next year, but then for the new rules in 26, it won't. There's various aspects to this, but just looking at it broadly, if you were the technical director of a team, presumably your dream scenario is having control of the chassis side and the engine side with your own in-house program, effectively, isn't it? So that's the ideal, provided you can do it well. So I don't know about you, but I see this, although it might be pragmatic for it might give them a bit of an uplift in results, it seems to have just represented an admission of defeat for a team that had what it needed. It had the ultimate setup that any team would love to have, and has voluntarily moved away from it, which is an extraordinary thing to do.
Yeah, I think if we look back through time, Renault have been the ones that have been in and out of Formula One more than any other team. Most other teams have come in, stayed for a while, and then perhaps gone. Honda again have come in and come back again because the environment changed for them. But Renault have been the one team from way back, from whenever I was, greased to my armpits from building drive shafts and stuff in the paddock. They've been there at times. So to say they've come and gone quite often. And that's a really strange thing to do because, at some points in time during that period, they did recognise that Formula One was actually quite good for them as far as marketing was concerned. So it's a bit strange that they've forgotten about it. But I think right now, one of the big problems is that, it's this Renault and Alpine. I don't think, that many people know what the Alpine bit means, that it's a car company in its own right, and it's, part of Renault. So there's a bit of a controversy there. And also the fact that it's a bit like I said about McLaren earlier. McLaren, the big thing they did to go from Honda to the Renault engine was to sort of get a measure against another team. And at that point in time, it was the Renault was the only engine they could get. So it's one of these things where, again, by Renault going to a Mercedes engine, they'll be able to point the finger in the right direction. Is it the chassis or is it the engine? Now, Ed, you and I were in the pre-season testing, and the Alpine looked horrible as a car. It really didn't look good at all. So they've recovered quite well, but it's still a bit random as to how their performance is going to be over a given weekend. And to build your own engines in Formula One, and now the engines are changing to a different specification, not that dramatically different for 2026, but they are changing, means you've got to do it all again. So it's a huge investment. And I think we all can see that the way that the Renault management has gone with Alpine, or the Alpine management has gone with Alpine, that it might be lining up somewhere to sell. And it's better to sell the team with a Mercedes engine in it, I would say, or the package with a Mercedes engine deal, than it is with a one-off Renault engine deal that's built in France in an independent company as such, because that could the cost of that would be huge just to run that one team. It's massive, besides a rental deal with Mercedes. So I can see the logic in it all, but at the end of the day, it loses an engine out of Formula One. It loses the works handle that Renault or Alpine might have on it, because it isn't anymore. It's a bit like Sauber. It's a bit like Audi, the Sauber running the Ferrari engine. They don't want to put the Audi name on it until it's an Audi engine. But they're running with a Ferrari engine at the moment. And again, Sauber's an example of this sort of situation. They've got a team, they've got a Ferrari engine in it, but they don't beat Ferrari. They don't beat Haas. So those teams they've got a measure against each other with that engine. And obviously, you can't say this Ferrari engine that we have in our Sauber is no good. You've got that engine, it's the chassis. You have to point the finger at the correct thing. For Renault, as far as financing the engine package is concerned, for one team, it's hugely expensive. For Alpine, they've got no measure against any other team. So put the Mercedes engine in it and see what happens.
Yeah, it's an interesting kind of scenario because, like you said, the whole Alpine brand is an odd one. It's obviously it's a brand that Renault's trying to build up. I think I was just looking it up. They've sold 4,328 cars in 2023, so very much small volume manufacturer. They are trying to expand their range and they've got grand ambitions, etc. But yeah, the F1 team's meant to be the primary promotional tool for that. And I must say, it always seems strange because the promotion that they're offering there seems to be we're better off without our own engines, which isn't necessarily a great message to send out. And I certainly agree that they, despite constantly vehemently denying it, it all seems to point towards a desire to sell it in the long term. But purely in terms of the practicality, can you see a short-term uplift from it? As you alluded to, they'll get a good measure. There's inevitably been tension between the two sides at Viry and Enstone for a long time. For the past few years, they kept talking about greater integration and how well that had worked, but it clearly hadn't, and that was shown by the fact that when the Viry-Châtillon Workers Council, that obviously has been very active because they're changing jobs, there's contractor job losses they've talked about as well. They blamed 80% of the underperformance on the chassis and 20% of the underperformance on the power unit in recent years, which I thought was quite an amusing amusing statement and very revealing about the dynamic between those two sides. But if you were technical director there, would you be thinking, okay, actually, I'm not too worried about the fact that we're sacrificing long-term potential because at least shorter term we can do better? and there's no point in having all the long-term potential in the world if you never get there.
Yeah, but what do you do? What do you do later? Do you fire it back up again? Because it's a hugely expensive site to just keep running.
Well, it's effectively starting up a fresh program again because they're retasking everything. There'll be some kit, but yeah, it's not. You can't turn the lights off and then turn it on in 18 months, can you?
No, you can't. That's for sure. And I mean, I've seen it before. It's right. This pointing the finger thing is always a difficult situation. Since I've stopped F1 full time, I've done I think 3 sort of little bits of consultancy with F1 teams. And the biggest thing I found when you went into a team and sort of sat around and chatted a little bit was everybody was pointing the finger at other departments. It was the aero department, it was the race team didn't do it right, or the mechanical design people aren't adventurous enough, or, none of them's working together. And that's the biggest thing you say whenever you come out of it is, look, get yourself, it's called team for a reason. You're all one. You're all trying to achieve the same goal. And you all have to report to each other, and you all have to accept what others are saying and try to think, could it be this reasoning? And I think that's the same thing, the 80%, 20% that the engine department and the chassis department, I mean, that's just inventing a number in the middle of space. I don't agree with it. If I look back to my time working with Peugeot, we had 3 years with them, 95, 96, and 97. And through hard work from the chassis design to the engine designers and back and forth, we went from an engine that 94 was struggle to do a race to a very competitive package in 97. And I would love to have continued in 98 with them, but it couldn't. We couldn't because of sponsorship and various deals that didn't happen and one thing or another. I consider that I pushed pretty hard to turn that package around and make it into something better, because better would be good for us. And we were doing things that, talking about stuff you couldn't believe, simple things like the valve train. You'd have a lot of problems with the air valve system. As well as at night testing, piping up different drains on the heads to try and get the heads to scavenge better so there wasn't so much oil in there. All of that was about moving forward and working together. So it's very, very difficult to get the two working together if you're that far apart. But, with Renault and Alpine, and if we call it's all one house really because of the ownership, they should be in a position where they work together and they really aren't pointing the finger at each other. For us as Jordan with Peugeot, we were separate companies. We were different companies. So it was much, much more difficult. But as I say, I don't understand this 80%, 20% stuff. That's just rubbish. And once you start to hear that, you're on the hiding to nothing.
Yeah, it's very, very revealing, isn't it, in that regard? But from your experience, what was the most positive partnership you had? Was it just better in the DFV days where you just knew what you had and it was a dependable product? Or did you prefer it working with the works manufacturers? Or is it kind of that in-between thing you had with Brian Hart at Jordan, when who obviously you speak very highly of? Yeah,
I mean, I think the best engineering working relationship was with Brian Hart, undoubtedly. A phone call from Brian to us about doing something, we'd get it done. A phone call from me to him about doing something, he'd get it done. You could discuss it and then you're both pulling in the same direction. At that point in time, finances were very, very limited, so it was very difficult for us or for Brian to get too adventurous. Then the switch to Peugeot was quite an incredible switch because, it was suddenly we went from a small lock-up of Brian's to went out there to this huge factory and, loads of people and multi-million franc or euro budget. And you thought, wow, and then you sort of get into the nitty-gritty of the engineering side of it and you realise that it's missing a lot. And it was really, really difficult to get that through to them and how to work, how to make it better. But once you did, I have to say they did a good job. So I think, an engineering company like Peugeot, it was great to work with them once you were working with them. But as I say, with Brian, as far as just the basic engineering was concerned, all that stuff that I'm talking about there with the Peugeot engine, you could have done over the telephone with Brian, and it would have, it would have been fixed automatically.
And of course, Peugeot, once they went in with Prost, and it kind of became this French super team, and there was sort of bits of government interference. It became very, very political, and funnily enough, the Peugeot progress suddenly dropped off. But it is interesting, this Alpine situation, but because Renault owns them both. They're both their own enterprises. Yeah. That's the thing, because a few people have said when I've questioned Renault's strategy, oh, well, McLaren party company with Honda, so this is the same as that. It's like, well, it's not, because McLaren didn't control the Honda program. It wasn't McLaren's own problem. No doubt, if you said to Andrea Stella, oh, you can have your own well-funded engine program that McLaren has full control over, that's well-equipped, etc., he'd be delighted with that. That's your ultimate setup for a team. So that's the thing that amazes me, that Renault's just relinquishing this. And of course, they're trying to push it as a great strategic positive move, aren't they? And that's the thing that I find a bit painful, because this is an organisation that's underachieved in F1 for quite some years now. And they've always tried to make virtues of negatives. Oh, we're going to succeed on 80% of the resources of the top teams. Well, funnily enough, that didn't work. Oh, it's great that we're a fully integrated works team. We're one of the few. Oh, no, actually, we don't need to be that. We can do this. Isn't this great? And it just feels like corporate politics and nonsense. And again, it only makes sense if they're moving towards selling it. If that's the case, then actually, good strategy. Mm-hmm. But of course, they can't say they're going to sell it, because they want to seem like a less motivated seller, don't they, to push the price up. So I feel a bit sorry for all of those working there, both on the engine and the chassis side, though, because they're kind of in the middle of all of this. And this is a team that's achieved some great things in the past, and an engine supplier that's achieved great things. And you just think, when's it ever going to just settle down for them?
Yeah, no, it's very, very true. I feel sorry for all of the workers there, because it's ridiculous. You have to have a plan, and you have to stick to that plan. And I agree with you, Ed. They always tried to find a way to do it on the cheap. Well, they've got the cost cap now. That's a massive, massive. If it's police correctly, the cost cap, that's a massive difference from what it was pre-cost cap. I mean, you're talking hundreds of millions potentially to be a top team. So it's all gone in the right direction for Renault, but they haven't taken advantage of it. And the big thing, they've got to do is really make sure that they end up with a product that is competitive, because if somebody else is going to buy it, that's what you have to be, is competitive. And you need to make sure that you're trying to fix the right things. I agree with you completely. The writing's on the wall for that team to be sold off to somebody, but it needs to be done as a complete entity this time, as the chassis factory. And there are people out there, I'm sure, interested in buying it. We know about the Andretti situation. And it opens the door for them with the GM engine, to be honest, because you could have a factory. But Andretti seemed to be keen to do it in their own way, and they were planning to go initially with the Renault engine, and obviously that drops that out the window. So it's raised a lot of concern in a lot of different areas, I think. But I think the end result will be that the Renault team, as such, the chassis team, does get sold to another buyer.
Yeah, and in fact, mentioning that Andretti thing, obviously that project is still rumbling along full steam ahead. They're still working on the basis they'll be on the grid in 2026. Quite understandably, they're not very convinced by this, you can come in 2028, because if you ask the FIA, there's no application process. There's no way to do it. So it feels like a bit of an empty promise at the moment. But yeah, they've certainly not been interested in buying Alpine. That's the team they don't like the look of. They've been, obviously, Michael Andretti's moved out of his full-time control position. He's still involved, but that could change the decision-making process. Obviously, there's a need for a power unit program, but there's a power unit that's being worked on. Obviously, the 26 engine they've been working on for some time. So you sort of start to wonder, well, could they buy the IP of that? They can't buy Viri, because that's staying with Renault. They've already talked about how they're retasking that, but at least it creates some opportunity for some phone calls, doesn't it? Just to see what might be possible.
Yeah, it does. Taking the Andretti thing as a situation, somebody somewhere must be spending a substantial amount of money. And if there's no
have spent a hell of a lot. I'd say they've... I don't know whether to admire or to deride the approach they've taken, because they have invested huge amounts already. They've got a lot of people employed there. I admire their boldness, but there's a risk there when you haven't got an entry.
Well, yeah, I mean, going way back to when we started Jordan and the amount of investment that Eddie had to put together to set up the team initially before it, really got an entry in Formula One, or before it really had enough money to get into Formula One.
All those millions you spent ordering things from catalogues initially.
Yeah, pencils. No, it was a bit of a different deal. I don't think there was millions by any means, but it was financed well for the time and the situation and the people we had. So it was controlled well and it was financed well. So no complaints about that whatsoever. We didn't have to stand back and not do anything, but there was only 3 of us doing something. And, we knew what a car cost because Eddie had been involved in Formula 3000, and we weren't building a car that was complicated or had anything trick. It wasn't, we weren't using uranium anywhere. It was all down to just common sense and engineering. But it's not like that anymore. And the Andretti team that's set up at the moment, as you say, is huge. A lot of people, a lot of money, big facility. So somebody's digging pretty deep into their pocket. And if that, if there's no promises of an entry or, being able to get into Formula One, then it's a big investment for nothing. And I was a bit surprised when I read that Michael had stepped back from the day-to-day running of the team. I mean, what does that mean? Does it mean that Michael stepped back from day-to-day running of the team, or that the other financiers think, hang on a minute or two, this is going down the pan the wrong way here. We need to sort of regroup a little bit. But time will tell. We'll have to wait and see. But there are, as I say, there may be other buyers out there for Renault. We'll just have to wait and see. And I'm pretty sure I agree with you, Ed. Renault would be sold tomorrow if the chassis set of it would be sold tomorrow, or Alpine would be sold tomorrow if a buyer came along with a reasonable sized check. And I'm sure that will happen. Whether it happens tomorrow, or whether it happens in 6 months or a year, I don't know. But Flavio is not involved to that level for nothing.
Well, that's the thing. He is the ideal person, probably, to a point, if that is your strategy, if your strategy is to sell. But so, yeah, I hope it gets stability, because there's still good people there. They've now got Ollie Oakes in as team principal. He's obviously got a very good reputation for the success in junior categories. So there's material to work with there. This is a team that has kind of risen to the top of F1 on 2 occasions. They've been championship winning forces in the 90s and then in the middle of the first decade of the 21st century. So there's a lot there, and I hope they'll get somewhere. It would just be nice if the negative stories stop. But it could be a while before there's the uplift in performance there. Right, as per tradition, the final part of the podcast is dedicated to your questions. If you'd like to send us one, you can do so on podcasts@the-race.com, podcasts@therace.com, and as long as they're at least tangentially technical, then we'll do our best to answer them. You can either send them in written form, or, as a couple of our question askers have on this episode, you can send them as a voice note.
Hi gentlemen, my name is Michael and I'm an F1 tragic from Australia. I've previously had dogs named Weber, Ricardo and now Oscar. So you can imagine I'm pretty thrilled with how Oscar Piastri is going. One fascinating thing has been his struggles with tyre management, which I think he's hopefully starting to get on top of. I was wondering if you could explain exactly what he's doing different now. Is it a matter of aiming for slower lap times at the start of the stint? Is there specific corners where he's trying to limit the slip and scrub? Or is there some other secret thing that's harder to explain? If Oscar had a time machine and could go back and have 1 minute with his rookie self, what message would he deliver so he could hopefully master the tyres from the start of his career?
I don't know about you, Gary. The first thing that strikes me there is Michael needs another dog called Doohan now, surely.
Yeah, well, I've got a question for Michael. Did Ricardo drink his water out of your shoe? That's always one of these things.
Well, dogs do like shoes, so I'm sure there'll be some shoe action.
Shoes and water do seem to go together. Yes, Doohan's coming up, eh? Well, right, going back to your questions, really. Tyre struggles are a thing that's been there for donkeys. Tyre struggles got really bad when we had the groove tyres in the late 90s, early 2000s, because you could just destroy a groove tyre immediately, just tear it to pieces, because, with each groove tyre, the idea of the groove was to reduce the tyre contact patch area, but not make the car look stupid with very narrow wheels. But it meant that you had sort of 3 or 4 independent sort of bits of rubber that were flexing on the ground and would just tear themselves apart. And that's still very true of the tyres. The thing is you need to look after them from the minute you leave the pits, because the minute you start to slide that little bit more, you can grain the surface very quickly. In other words, you get little bits of rubber rolling on the surface because you tear the top part of the surface off. Or you overheat the surface, and basically it starts sliding even more. So it's a spiral to nowhere. So it's when you leave the pits, it's about driving, I suppose you could say, within the tyre. I don't mean going slower lap times, but just not overdriving the tyre, not making it slide too much, not spinning it too much, just taking the best out of the tyre and letting the tyre come to you, letting the tyre grip level build up, as opposed to initially overdriving it. So it's just about having that feel, I think, I suppose the best way of putting it. The driver needs to have that feel where that limit really is and not overdrive it. Once it starts to go away from you, you're stuck. So you'll see somebody be able to do, maybe taking a stint length of 30 laps on a given tyre, and somebody else struggling at 15. And that's just because they sort of abused it too early. And, the guy that did 30 laps, their first 5 or 10 laps on that tyre would have been, at a more consistent pace, and then they'd suddenly be able to push more into the tyre, whereas the other guy would have abused the tyre too much for those 5 or 10 laps, and suddenly you just can't get them back again. So I think it's just about looking after the tyre and really feeling where the slip angle is, both on the steering and on the throttle pedal, and obviously cornering speed. But as I say, it doesn't necessarily mean you go slower. It just means that you just go more consistently. And if Oscar had a time machine, I don't think he needs to go back and talk to himself. I think that's a learning curve you've all got to do. I think if he did have something, what message would it deliver? And it would be not to try and win the race on your first lap out of the pits or a first lap off the grid. The race is 50 or 60 laps long, and it's the last 10 or 15, 20 laps of the race that count. So at the end of the day, don't try to win it on your first couple of laps on a new set of tyres. Just try to win it at the end of the race as opposed to at the beginning of the race.
It's an interesting point, really, because the whole art of, as you've alluded to there, of learning how to manage the tyres, it's a very multifaceted thing. I've asked Oscar a few times about that this year, and he says a big part of it is just knowing what different circumstances should create different courses of action. It's all about building up that experience. And that's why I don't think if he had a time machine, he could go back and give himself some advice on the tyres, because he'll have had plenty of advice from people on the tyres. But until you've experienced that and felt it and developed that feel, I think it's very, very difficult to apply that. It's all just a question of time, because there's so many different things. Is it the fronts? Is it the rears that are limited? Like Sergio Perez is a brilliant tyre manager when it comes to the rear slip. Brilliant on it, one of the best. But when he's managing the fronts, it's a bit different. He's not actually particularly remarkable when it comes to that. And then you've got those questions of, as you say, you can't win the race on the first lap. But there are occasions when it might be wise to do it. Yeah. Such as Baku when he passed Leclerc early on. But in doing that, he took more out of his tyres, because if you push the tyres very hard initially when there's the maximum tread, you get a lot more movement and you accelerate the deg. So it's having that feel for those trade-offs, and then I guess being able to kind of detect what the tyres are doing through stints and how to modify what you're doing, because it's so three-dimensional. As you say, it's not about driving slower, and often actually lapping quickly while managing the tyres, quickly relatively, is the real art. And I actually think Lando Norris is very good at it, but Piastri doesn't have a big weakness or anything. He's not terrible at it. It's just he was a rookie last year, so he's learning, and he's being compared to a driver like Norris, who is very, very clever. Mexico last year is the classic example of how he did it, how he can manage the tyres. He's up against someone who's very, very good at that and has got that data bank, and it's all right, it's this situation. So it's never one size fits all.
Yeah, I think he's right. Whenever you look back at what he says about free air being fast there, he knows that following somebody closely for a while is not good for you, the tyres or anything. And that's really why whenever he passed Leclerc, it was correct. He did overdrive the tyres in that early stage. But he knew that it was going to be worse by sitting in his gearbox, and he was fast enough to be there. He was fast enough to be in the lead. So he had to do it to get in the lead. And And as I say, that's acceptable, but it's one of these sort of situations you need to carry enough, have enough in the back locker to take you to the end of the race. And he just had, I suppose you might call it, he just had. The big thing was that the Ferrari rear tyres were going away as quickly as Oscar's probably all 4 tyres were going away. So the difference was okay, Ferrari lost traction dramatically and just couldn't use it coming off the corners. So at the end of the day, it's, by Oscar getting in the front of Charles Leclerc, it meant that Leclerc was in a turbulent air and abusing his tyres. So it's a twofold situation, but everything has to be read correctly. And I don't think he's doing a bad job personally. I think he's doing a pretty good job. And every day is a school day. And that's the important thing about it. And I think he's very good at that, making sure that every day is a school day. You learn something new every time you get in the car.
Yeah, very, very much so. And he'll keep learning. And in fact, even the most experienced drivers on the grid are still learning things about the tyres, because obviously the tyres do change with time and everything's so sensitive to conditions and the race situation, etc. There's almost infinite possibility. So an endless learning experience, that one. The next question is also an audio one.
Hello, Ed and Gary. Thank you for your wonderful tech show. And I'm Ben from Germany, and I have a question for you. When I was watching the Singapore Grand Prix, I was seeing an onboard of one of the, or both of the Alpines. And when they were driving on the straight, there was a certain very distinct oscillating noise of their engine. So it was not the normal up-revving noise coming from the engines. It was like always like it was cut off. So this was not in the traction zone or something like that. So it couldn't be attributed to the oscillations of curbs or anything like that. So I was wondering if that is just some blip from the international TV sound bites, or if you have also observed this and have a technical answer for that. Thank you very much, and I'm always a great fan of your show.
This is a really interesting one because it actually made me, because there are differences in the Renault engine sound. And I actually remember all the way back to Jerez in 2014, you remember when we were there and the cars were first running, the hybrid era engines for the Renault have always had there's been a bit of an underlying oscillation sound you can hear in the engine. It was quite pronounced then. Harder to detect now, but I wonder if that's just a characteristic they've had throughout the engine development.
Yes, it's a difficult one. I mean, obviously it could be, as you say, just something to do with the international TV sound, but I don't think so. I think there is something there now. It's always difficult to say, but one of the things that it could be, and I'll try and explain it. The turbo itself is connected up with a shaft to the MGUH. In other words, it's an electrical motor that's on the end of the turbo. And what you can do is you can use whatever power you can generate from that motor whenever you want. It's extra to the amount you're allowed to use from the battery pack. So you have got an extra advantage there. The other thing is the turbo, the boost pressure that the turbo generates is really what controls the fuel flow. And the fuel flow is controlled through a fuel flow valve, 100 kilograms per hour, I think they call it. And it's an instantaneous reading as far as I know that, you're not allowed to go above that at any point in time. So what you do, also the turbo RPM, the maximum RPM is limited. I think it's 125,000 RPM, so it's a bit of a rev on, I must say. But what you can do then with the MGUH is you load it up against the turbo. So whenever the turbo gets up to near its maximum speed, or gets up to the boost pressure gets to near its maximum for the fuel flow you can have, you load the MGUH up against it and generate electrical power. So you're trying to get to a point where you're using maximum fuel flow, as near as possible maximum turbo speed that you have designed the engine to have, and generating some electrical power out of the MGUH. So all of that packaged together is the maximum power you're getting from the ECU, or from the normally aspirated engine, and the maximum power you can get out of the electrical system at the same point in time. Now you can load that up as a constant, but it's pretty difficult, I think, to get it as a constant. So what you can do is load it up and then release it, and load it up again and release it. So you'll hear like an undulation of the engine or the turbo speed as you load up against the turbo speed. the turbo speed will get a little bit lower. You get down to a boost pressure that's not giving you the maximum normally aspirated engine power. Then you release the turbo again. So you go up and down that little bit that can give you an oscillation. I think it's quite difficult to keep it as a constant because you're fighting all this thing against the drag of the car, many other scenarios. So it's about the strategy I think you're using for getting the best out of everything at that point in time. And as I say, you have two different systems, an electrical system and a normally aspirated engine, and you want to try and get the best out of both of them at the same point in time. So it could be something to do with that.
Yeah, it's an interesting example of how distinctive the engines are now, in that although in the old days, in the pre-hybrid days, you could tell the difference between the engines. It was a much more simple sound, if you see what I mean. Whereas now there's so much more texture and there's much more going on in there. And it has sort of reduced as the hybrid era's gone on. But because you can actually listen to the engines without destroying your ears completely, there are these interesting things. And definitely I think that question has picked up on something, and we can only, as you've just done very well there, have a guess at what factors might influence that. But I think it's the positive side of these engines, in that there's texture and depth there that if you regularly hear them, you kind of get to know a little bit, and you can tell there's interesting stuff going on, even though it's very, very hard to learn anything from it. It's more just showing that there's things going on and there are differences.
Yeah, I mean, the RPM has gone up since these regulations were put in place. I mean, when we first listened to them in 2014, it was pretty dismal, really. But it was all part of everything. It was just the learning curve. At that point in time, they were doing, 11,500 RPM or something. Now they're knocking on the door of 15,000 RPM. I think it's a limit of 15,000. So yes, the RPM has gone up, and then you've got to control that a little bit more sophisticatedly, I suppose you might say. So the control strategy for doing all of that, I mean, you sort of want to get to the maximum of everything you can, and the maximum of everything you can is getting the best out of your normally aspirated engine and the best out of your electrical source from A, what you can drag out of the battery, B, what you can recharge through the MGU-K, and then, as I say, the MGU-H is something that you can build up your turbo speed with if you want to, because you can use an electric motor to spin the turbo up so you don't get any turbo lag. But then you can also use it to hold the turbo back so it doesn't over rev or it doesn't over boost the engine. So, I mean, I think it was a couple of races ago where Gasly was done for using too much fuel on the fuel flow meter in qualifying. So obviously it's an area where they're pushing to the limit. And pushing to the limit means you've got to have a very decent control strategy on it. So I would think it's somewhere in that circle that there's something that they're doing to try to get a little bit more out of it as best possible.
And our third and final question comes from Hoob Marchich, who says, to assist a driver in finding the best slipstream position when following a car on long straights, could a team use a device that measures and indicates to the driver the lowest dynamic air pressure at the front of the car? This would help most when headwinds come a bit from the side or when the distance between the two cars is fairly large.
Well, to a certain extent they do. Obviously, they've got a pitot tube on the front of the cars, which is measuring the airspeed. And you can, to a certain extent, measure the speed, the wind direction from that pitot tube as well. So it's there, but it's a response to it at that given point in time. If you're actually driving the car, you will feel in the car that's following another car, you will feel when you get this acceleration, this sudden, like the car just moves that little bit faster. So the driver has a good feel for that when he's in that pocket of air. And to be honest, the drag, the rear wing obviously, and the diffuser, there's a very tall wake coming off the rear wing. So you're quite close to the car in front of you before you actually get a real tow from the low pressure that you're driving into. If you were probably 25 metres back, 30 metres back from the car in front of you, you would be getting very little of a tow. You get something because it's not that you're in the hole behind the other car. The fact that the car is moving the air and you're in that movement helps you a little bit all the time. It's a bit like IndyCar racing. They talk about one lap qualifying, about the fact that the air isn't circulating. Whereas if you get 10, 20 cars out there all together, the air starts to circulate with the cars. So you get a free sort of bit of top speed because of that. But I think the driver in the car can feel this when he's getting into that pocket. And he knows then, that's where you want to be. He'll know that better than anything. But it's relatively close to the other car. It's definitely, within 10 metres, even less than that probably, before you really get that big suck.
Yeah, and teams do put a lot of thought into how best to optimise the slipstream on the tracks where it's really beneficial, because, of course, you've got the challenge of what you gain on the straights you can lose in the corners because you're in the dirty air. So there's always they're actually looking for a gentler effect than the kind of maximum slipstream, if you like, because if you start, say, a qualifying lap right behind someone, the absolute optimum slipstream, it's probably going to damage the rest of your lap as well in the twisty bits. So, yeah, as always in Formula One, it's more complicated than you might think. Well, many thanks for those excellent questions and, of course, for those great answers from you, Gary. And if you do have a question for us, please send it to podcasts@therace.com. That's podcasts@the-race.com. And we'll be back in the build-up to the United States Grand Prix, so join us then for more from Gary.
The Athletic.